All right, so today we're going to get into No Other Name, Part 7, and we're going to go finally to the Tanakh. It's time to go to the foundation, to the Tanakh. You know, normally with the teaching series, if you're familiar with the teachings we've been doing here, you know, we generally like to start in the Tanakh and work our way forward, building a case so that the Brit Kadashah makes sense. But in this case, I wanted to really establish what was going on in the Brit, what Yeshua was talking about, and establish where we're headed toward as far as where it talks about things like there's no other name by which you must be saved, that he's the name above all names. What does that all mean? And so we kind of covered that up to this point. And I think with that foundation, it's now going to be interesting to see how it started at the beginning. So we're going to go to the beginning. We're going to go to Bereshit, to Genesis chapter 2. And we're going to kind of hopefully get through a good chunk of Genesis and Exodus today. And so in Genesis chapter 2, Bereshit, Genesis chapter 2, we're going to begin in verse 19. Now before we start, let's remember what our definition of name is. We're talking about that when we see the word name, it's usually referring to the authority. It's referring to the identity. It's referring to the reputation, referring to the lineage, as in if we claim to be a part of a group that has a name, then a family, that's part of the lineage. We're grafted into a name, that name being Israel. So there's a lineage there. And so these are the things that we're looking at. A title, the name could have to do with a title, which means authority, again, or what level of authority someone may have. If I tell you that I am in a congregation and I am the rabbi, that's different than if I tell you I'm the elder. That's different than if I tell you I'm the deacon, right? These are all different titles that have different perceptions of levels of authority. The same thing in a business. If I tell you I'm the president of the company, as opposed to a supervisor or a vice president or whatever it is, all titles that help you to understand levels of authority. But let's continue now in the study with Genesis chapter 2 and verse 19 with that foundation in mind. And from the ground Yahweh Elohim formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So the man gave names to all the livestock and to the birds of the heavens and to every beast of the field. But for the man there was not found a helper for him as his counterpart. So let's first understand that part of the idea of the name, again, we're going back to identity. He identified that a zebra was a zebra, a giraffe was a giraffe, etc. He named the things based on what they were. And the names that he gave them in the Hebrew would not be the same as it is in the English. But just understand, it had to do with, he said, he looked at them and identified them, and whatever he called them, that was its name. So it was an identifier with what it was and how it functioned and what it looked like. In other words, it was a full encompassing idea that he looked at it and said, that's a hippopotamus, that's a whatever, okay? And so I think that's also part of us understanding titles or names when we call somebody an elder, or we call somebody a rabbi, or we call somebody a deacon, or in the Hebrew we call them a zaken or a shamash. That these names or titles are descriptors of what they are and how they function. And this is going to be important when we get into the next part of this teaching, when we get into breaking down leadership, and that leadership is broken down with titles for positions. Now those titles identify a connotation that you would have. Like I've said often, birds fly, fish swim, because, you are what you are. Well, the same thing we're going to see. Leaders lead. Servants serve. And so the titles revolve around all that. And so we continue now in verse 21. And it says, and so Yahweh Elohim caused a deep sleep to fall on the man, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in its place. And the rib which Yahweh Elohim had taken from the man, he made into a woman, and he brought it to the man. And the man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one is called woman because she was taken out of man. So he named her as well. He says, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And so here you have this understanding about names. And so he named all the creatures, and he also named his wife, with the idea that this was a woman, which means she was taken out from man. Now let's go to Genesis chapter 11. Bereshit, Genesis chapter 11 and verse 1. Bereshit, Genesis 11 and in verse 1. And all the earth had one language and one speech. And it came to be as they set out from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there, and they said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come and let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens, and make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over all the face of the earth." Then Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. Now realize in verse 4, they had an understanding that there was a possibility that they would be scattered. And so they're actually almost trying to do this in a rush to say, if we can do this fast enough and accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, we can get away with it, so to speak. Because they understood that what they were doing would likely bring a punishment or a penalty of being scattered. And Yahweh said, "Look, they are one people and they have one language, and this is what they begin to do. And now they are not going to be withheld from doing whatever they plan to do. Come, let us go there and confuse their language so that they do not understand one another's speech." And Yahweh scattered them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. That is why its name was called Bavel, because there Yahweh confused the language of all the earth, and from there Yahweh scattered them over the face of all the earth. Now, I brought this out because we're not going to go through every place where a river is named or a place is named, but I just want to give you an example that here, the Hebrew is Bavel. Bavel in Hebrew means confusion. It has a connection to the idea of mixture. Okay, so there was a lot of these things that were going on here in Babel, or Bavel, like Babylon. And so here we have this going on, and he names the place. That is why the name of this place is what it is, because it's a place where there was mixture and confusion, where the languages got mixed and confusion set in, and then they were scattered. And so we find that that's why things are named, and that's why people are named. And, we find that that's why, when we have like Jacob and Esau, Esau was named because of the red and the hair, and Jacob was named, etc. All of them have names based on things that were connected to them in some way. They're identifiers. Okay? So we talked about names and identity. So this city was identified with the fact that this is where there was mixture and there was confusion. Now let's go to chapter 12 and in verse 1. And Yahweh said to Abram, "Go yourself out of your land, from your relatives and from your father's house, to a land which I show you, and I shall make you a great nation and bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." So let's stop there. He says to Abram, he says, "Look, go yourself out of your land." This is in Bereshit in Genesis 12:1. "Go yourself out, and I'm going to make you a great nation and bless you and make your name great." Now remember, we've talked about this already so many times. Obviously, it was nothing about just Abraham having this, like the name itself, Abram. Actually, at this point, it's only Abram, not Abraham. And making Abram like somehow this great name. He says, no, you're going to have a great reputation. You're going to be well known. You're going to have a lineage. You're going to have authority. You're going to have a title. You know what his title is that we refer to him as? Abraham Avinu. Abraham, our father, because he was the father of all of these peoples that came, and it started with Abraham. He says, "And I shall bless those who bless you and curse him who curses you, and in you all the clans of the earth shall be blessed." So this is something that's going on here in chapter 12 and in verse 1. So here we see Yahweh referring to a better understanding, hopefully, of what the idea of name is. He's saying, I'm going to make you have a great reputation. Your name is going to be held in very high esteem. In other words, who you are, your identity, identifying you will be highly esteemed. These things will be connected to you as part of who you are and your identity. So let's go to chapter 13 and in verse 1. Chapter 13, verse 1. "And Abram went up from Mitzrayim into the south, and he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him. And Abram was very rich in livestock and in silver and in gold, and he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first, and there Abram called on the name of Yahweh. Okay, actually let's go back to chapter 12, and now I know where the problem was. It was actually verse 7. Okay, so let's go back to chapter 12, verse 7. It says, and Yahweh appeared to Abram, and he said, to your seed I give this land. And he built an altar to Yahweh who had appeared to him. So he built an altar to Yahweh, and in verse 8 he says, and from there he moved to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and he built there an altar to Yahweh and called on the name of Yahweh. So here we have him calling on the name of Yahweh. He builds an altar and he calls on the name. Now, by calling on the name, the Hebrew there has the idea of calling out to. Calling out to Yahweh. He's giving honor and respect and paying homage to Yahweh. And we're going to see later, as we go further into the study, we'll see a deeper connection. So hold this in your mind. We're definitely going to connect this up. And then we see this again in chapter 13 and in verse 4, that again, he makes an altar to Yahweh in verse 4, the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram again calls on the name of Yahweh. So he's not necessarily, I'm planting a seed now, he's not necessarily just standing there making an altar and going, Yahweh. That's not what it means to call on the name. What he's doing is he's building an altar. So of course, altars have to do with giving honor, respect, and authority to someone, because that's the way that we've always done this as a culture, whether it was pagan or the true, is that we make altars, we build altars, and that's where we pray, we make sacrifices, and we pay homage to what we believe is our God, our Elohim, our Creator. And so it's when he makes these altars that he's doing it in the name of, with the authority of, and to pay homage to the name of Yahweh. The authority of Yahweh, the identity of Yahweh, who Yahweh is. So let's have that in mind, because you'll see this over and over again. I'm not going to read every place he does it, but whenever he builds an altar, you're going to see this happening. In chapter 26, we're going to see this again in verse 23. Let's stay in Bereshit in Genesis chapter 26 in verse 23. And from there he went up to Beersheba, and Yahweh appeared to him that same night and said, I am Yahweh your Elohim, father Abraham. I am the Elohim of your father Abraham. I do not fear, for I am with you, and shall bless you and increase your seed for my servant Abraham's sake. And he built an altar there and called on the name of Yahweh, and he pitched his tent there, and the servants of Yitzchak dug a well there. Okay, so again, Abraham is mentioned here, and we see that there's a well that's dug, and then in the well being dug, etc., that there's an altar there, and that Yahweh's name is called upon. And notice that there's a connection here, just like there was in chapter 12, to blessings. He says, do not fear, I am with you, and shall bless you and increase your seed for my servant Abraham's sake. So this is where we see this continuing idea that Yahweh is blessing, Yahweh is then honored with an altar, and his name is called upon. His authority is called upon, his identity is paid homage to and respected and given honor. Let's go now to chapter 32. Chapter 32 of Genesis, and in verse 24. Chapter 32 and verse 24. And Yaakov was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. And when he saw that he did not overcome him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Yaakov's hip was dislocated as he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaks. And he said, I am not letting you go until you have blessed me. So he asked him, what is your name? And he said, Yaakov. And he said, your name is no longer called Yaakov, but Yisrael, because you have striven with Elohim and with men and have overcome. And Yaakov asked him, saying, please let me know your name. And he said, why do you ask about my name? And he blessed him there. And Yaakov called the name of the place Peniel, which means, for I have seen Elohim face to face, and my life was preserved. And the sun rose on him, and he passed over Penuel, and he limped on his hip. Now, bear in mind as we're going through this, and you've probably heard this taught many times, but I want to maybe hopefully cover it a little bit differently. You see two things happening name-wise. First of all, because something different was about to be happening with Yaakov, his name was being changed to Yisrael. We saw that happen also with Avram, had his name changed to Avraham. And so without getting into all of the details of why the names were changed, everything, just understand that names were changed because they were going to function as individuals somewhat differently from that point forward. And so the name being an identifier, having to do with their identity, needed to change. So now Yisrael is his name. Yaakov is no longer going to be his name because it's going to be a new identifier as to who and what he's going to function as. And then we have the second thing that comes up with the name where the one he's wrestling with, he says, let me know your name. Yaakov says, well, let me know your name. And he goes, why do you seek about my name? And then he blessed him. Now, he never answers the question, well, why do you seek about my name? And the answer to the thing is that I don't think he was asking anything about the actual pronunciation of his name. He was asking, please let me know your authority, because I believe you can bless me. I'm trying to identify you. I'm trying to figure out who you are, what authority you have. Because he says, look, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. And so he's trying to confirm that this is actually one with authority to bless him. And so I don't think that we should necessarily connect this to him wanting to actually just know the entity's name. But he was more importantly wanting to understand, who are you? Who are you? Not just your name, who are you? What authority do you have? What is your authority to give a blessing? And so the answer was given by him doing the blessing. He's like saying, are you one who has authority to do this? If you are, I'm not letting you go until you do it. And so again, it had nothing to do with trying to figure out the actual name, at least not in my opinion. This is confirmed, by the way, when his name was changed from Yaakov to Yisrael. We have that confirmed in chapter 35. So let's go there. Chapter 35 of Genesis, Bereshit 35, and in verse 9. It says, Elohim appeared to Yaakov again, and he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. And Elohim said to him, your name is Yaakov. Your name is no longer to be called Yaakov, but Yisrael is your name. So he called his name Yisrael. You see how that connects right back. That also connects back to the authority that the one had that he wrestled with, doesn't it? And Elohim said to him, I am El Shaddai. Bear fruit and increase. A nation and a company of nations shall be from you, and sovereign shall come from your body. He says, in the land which I gave Abraham and Isaac I give to you, and to your seed after you I give this land. And Elohim went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him, and Yaakov set up a standing column in the place where he had spoken with him, a monument of stone, and he poured a drink offering on it, and he poured oil on it. And Yaakov called the name of the place where Elohim spoke with him, Beth-El, or the house of El. Now notice what's going on here. Again, there's a connection to Yahweh giving blessings, and then there being an altar of some sort built to honor and to reverence that name. And so here we see that connection again. And by the way, we're going to see later on when we get to Exodus, this idea of, was I not known to them as the Almighty One, El Shaddai, El Almighty? And here he says, right here he goes to Yaakov, he says, I am El Shaddai. I am the mighty El. And so this is what we need to understand. And so let's continue with this in chapter 48. Chapter 48 of Bereshit. Now again, we're able to go through this fairly quickly because we've already laid this all out for 6 other parts of this in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. So hopefully this is easily just piecing together here as we go through it. In chapter 48 of Genesis, Bereshit, in verse 8, and Yisrael saw Joseph's sons and said, whose are these? And Joseph said to his father, they are my sons whom Elohim has given me in this place. And he said, please bring them to me and let me bless them. And the eyes of Yisrael were dim with age, and he was unable to see. And he drew them near, and he kissed them and embraced them. Now, by the way, understand that blessing doesn't always have to come from Yahweh. Here's a man wanting to bless his children. And so when Jacob was wrestling, he didn't have to be thinking that the one he was wrestling was actually the Almighty himself. He simply had the idea that whoever it was had authority to give a blessing. And that's an important piece of that as well. But now here he goes, I will bring them to me so I can bless them. And verse 11, Yisrael said to Yosef, I had not thought to see your face, but see, Elohim has also shown me your seed. So Yosef brought them from between his knees, and he bowed down with his face to the earth. So this is again where he's worshiping. There's the word worship in there. He worships down to the face of the earth. And Yosef took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Yisrael's left, and Manasseh with his left toward Yisrael's right, and brought them near him. And Yisrael stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, and his left, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, consciously directing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. So apparently Yisrael's sight wasn't so dim. It just wasn't real great, but he certainly wasn't blind. He purposefully directed his hands. He knew what he was doing. He consciously directed his hands. And in verse 15, so he says, and he blessed Yosef and said, the Elohim before whom my fathers Abraham and Yitzchak walked, the Elohim who has fed me all my life long to this day, the messenger who has redeemed me from all evil, bless these youths. And let my name be called upon them, and the name of my fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and let them increase to a multitude in the midst of the earth. Okay, so understand what's going on here. He's blessing these children. He's asking actually the one who blessed him to bless these children. And notice what he's saying here. He says, and let my name be called upon them. So you have two things happening over here. This is actually a legal adoption process in the ancient Near East. So he's legally adopting Joseph's children as his own. But then on top of that, he's also saying, let my reputation, let the blessings that were given to me pass on to them. Let my identity as the one who's been receiving the blessings be passed on to them. Because remember, he was going to pass those things on to someone. Likely it was going to be Joseph. And now he's wanting to make sure that Joseph is not going to get to choose how he's going to do it. He's actually going to do it for Joseph, because Joseph would have done it the other way. He would have blessed the older in a different way than from the younger. He would have put his right hand on Manasseh and not on Ephraim. But he said, Yaakov knew it had to be reversed. And so Yaakov crosses over his hands and switches them up on the children. But he says, let my name be on them. Let my name be on them, and the name of my fathers. So it's not just an adoption process, but he says the reputation, the authority, the identity, the blessings that were given. There was a blessing process that we read about that started with Abram, and then it went to Isaac, then it went to Jacob, and we learned this all in the teaching I did called The Identity of Israel, so you can listen to that teaching, which talks about how the blessings and the authority got passed down. And here he's passing that specific series of blessings now onto the children of Yosef. And so that's why there's a connection to the name. It's not like all of a sudden these children are going to walk around and their names are both going to change from Manasseh and Ephraim to being Yaakov. He didn't say, let my name be on them, and all of a sudden they're going to now start referring to these guys as Yaakov. So they got two boys named Yaakov now, or two boys named Israel. That's not what's happening here. See, but in the sacred name movement, and I don't want to attack in any way, but in the sacred name movement, we need to stick the Yah in Yeshua, or Yeshua, because after all, he came in his father's name, so his father's name has to be in his name. So why isn't his name Yahweh Shua? Or Yahusha Shua, whatever way you pronounce Yahweh, or however people do it, Yahuwah Shua. Why do we just stick the Yah in there? See, when we're missing the point, this is exactly what's going on here with Yaakov. These children didn't all of a sudden have part of Yaakov in their name. He said, my name, my reputation, my lineage, the blessings on me, all of that authority, all of that is being passed on to you. There's no changing of the pronunciation of their names to stick Yaakov in there somehow, or Yisrael. You still have Ephraim, and you still have Manasseh. Those names are not changing at all. Now, sometimes you do find Ephraim referred to as Yisrael, because Ephraim now represents the blessings from Yisrael, because he now got the firstborn blessing, even though he wasn't the firstborn. He was the younger. But we have that. So Ephraim is now getting those blessings. So we find throughout Scripture, sometimes when it talks about the house of Israel, we sometimes hear it talking about the house of Ephraim, because they become interchangeable, but we don't stick Yisrael into the name of Ephraim and make it like Yisrael Ephraim or something, or Yisrael. I don't know, whatever you would do. You see, but just understand that this is part of the problem in our movement, or in the body, is that people do this. They take the Father's name, or they take at least the front part of it, the Yah part, and they want to shove it into everything. That's not the way Hebrew works. We talked about that probably in part 1 of this series, and we're talking about it again now. So here you see an example of how it works. He said, my name is now upon them. They now bear my name. My family name, my lineage, my reputation, my authority, the blessings. That's what the lineage part comes in, by the way. They're now carrying on the lineage where the blessings are being passed on to them. All right, let's go now to Shemot. We're going to Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. And we're going to begin in verse 1. In Shemot in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 1. And Moshe was shepherding the flock of Yitro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mount of Elohim, and the messenger of Yahweh appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked and saw the bush burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. And Moshe said, let me turn aside now and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. And Yahweh saw that he turned aside to see, and Elohim called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moshe, Moshe. And he said, Hineni, here I am. And he said, do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is set apart ground, it's kadosh ground. And he said, I am the Elohim of your father, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Yitzchak, and the Elohim of Yaakov. And Moshe hid his face, for he was afraid to look at Elohim. Now let me stop there for a second. Look at the way names are being used here to help identify who Yahweh is. I am Yahweh. Who am I? I'm the Elohim of your fathers. I'm the Elohim of Abraham. I'm the Elohim of Yitzchak. I'm the Elohim of Yaakov. I'm the one who did this. So he's pointing to the authority, the reputation, the identity, the history of the thing so that he knows exactly who he's speaking with. And so that's why we constantly see this reference to the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not the Elohim of the Philistines. He's not the Elohim of all the different ites, the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Jebusites, and all that. I am the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's who I am. And so it's part of identifying him using these names to link him to something that Moshe would know. Moses would know about the God of the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he says, verse 7. Okay, we're up to verse 7. He says, and Yahweh said, I have indeed seen the oppression of my people who are in Mitzrayim and have heard their cry because of their slave drivers, for I know their sorrows. And I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Mitzrites and to bring them up from the land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Those are the guys I just mentioned earlier. He says, I'm not their Elohim. He says, and now see, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Mitzrites oppressed them. By the way, when I say he's not their Elohim, yeah, sure, he created them too. But they are not choosing to acknowledge him for who he is. They are worshiping other ones made of stone and wood, etc. They're not recognizing and honoring and worshiping the true Elohim. He says, I'm the one that was worshipped and honored by your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Verse 9, he says, and now see, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I've seen the oppression with which the Mitzrites oppressed them, and now, come, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Mitzrayim. And Moshe says to Elohim, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Mitzrayim? And he said, because I am with you, and this is to you the sign that I have sent you, when you brought the people out of Mitzrayim, you are to serve Elohim on this mountain. And Moses says to Elohim, see, when I come to the children of Israel, and they say to them, the Elohim of your fathers has sent me to you, And they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And Elohim said to Moshe, I am that which I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And Elohim said further to Moshe, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, Yahweh, Elohim of your fathers, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Yitzchak, the Elohim of Yaakov, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my remembrance to all generations. So what is he saying here? He says, first of all, this is what you're going to say to the children. You're going to say that I am has sent me. So who is this I am? The people must have had an understanding that their Elohim was the one that always existed, exists, and will always exist. That in a sense, he is existence itself. So that's why saying I am is such a powerful thing. It's all-encompassing. He just is. But what about before that? No, he just is. He was, he is, he will be, that's it. He's everything. But that isn't enough. He needs to connect it to where they'll understand. So in the verse 15, he says, and then we remind them that I am the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am that one. He says, and this is my name, my remembrance, my name forever. So what is his name forever? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's not just about it being Yahweh. My reputation, my lineage, my authority, who I am, my identity is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is my name forever, and this is my remembrance to all generations. I shall be remembered as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. See, again, people want to get into these verses and try to link it to pronouncing Yahweh. And it's not about pronouncing Yahweh. Who is he? He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's who he is. Does he have a name? Yes, he has a name. How you pronounce it, I don't know. Okay, I say Yahweh, you say what you say, that's fine. But let's understand as we're going through this that it's not about that, it's about understanding he's identified as his remembrance. How do we remember him today? This is thousands and thousands of years later. We remember him as he is the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the one, not the Elohim of the thisites and the thatites and the these guys and the those guys. This is the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, go and you shall gather the elders, verse 16, of Israel together and say to them, Yahweh, Elohim of your fathers, the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me saying, I have indeed visited you and seen what is done to you in Mitzrayim. And I say, I am bringing you up out of the affliction of Mitzrayim into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittite and the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, to a land flowing with milk and honey. So he's saying again in verse 16, he's reminding us even again, tell them I am the one from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Verse 18, and they shall listen to your voice, and you shall come, you and the elders of Israel, to the sovereign of Mitzrayim, and you shall say to him, Yahweh, Elohim of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness to slaughter to Yahweh our Elohim. See, this is not about being the I am as much as he's saying, look, there's no defining me into some sort of finite box. I just am. But how can you put me? You can put me based on my identity, lineage, reputation, authority, my title. I'm connected as being, I am the one that was with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's who I am. So hopefully it's starting to make a little bit more sense. He says, because then in verse 18 it says, you're going to go to the sovereign and say, Yahweh Elohim of the Hebrews. Well, who was the first Hebrew? Abraham. So he's saying, look, this is the God of the Hebrews. You have the God of the Egyptians and the God of everything under the sun. No, this is the God of the Hebrews. He has sent us, and he needs you to let us go 3 days journey into the wilderness so that we can slaughter to Yahweh our Elohim. So that's what's going on here. Now, this is, the key is that, remember in verse 15, he says, this is my remembrance to all generations. We're linking a reputation and identity to being the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All right, let's continue now in chapter 5. Shemot, Exodus chapter 5, and in verse 1. And afterwards Moses and Aaron went in and said to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh Elohim of Israel, let my people go so that they keep a festival to me in the wilderness. Now notice the way he's being identified. He's not just saying, thus said Yahweh. He's saying, thus said Yahweh, who is the Elohim of Yisrael. So that the Pharaoh would understand who this is. It identifies him. And Pharaoh says, who is Yahweh, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I don't know Yahweh, nor am I going to let Israel go. And by the way, that was a very true statement. I mean, clearly Pharaoh didn't know Yahweh. He had no relationship with Yahweh. He said, well, so I don't know him, so why should I let you go? I'm not going to obey his voice. I don't know him. And they said, the Elohim of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and slaughter the Yahweh our Elohim, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. But the sovereign of Mitzrayim said to them, Moshe and Aaron, why do you take the people from their work? Get back to your burdens. And Pharaoh said, see, the people of the land are many now, and you make them cease from their burdens. And the same day Pharaoh commanded the slave drivers of the people and their foremen, saying, you are no longer to give the people straw to make bricks as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves, and lay on them the required amount of bricks which they have made before, and do not diminish it, for they are idle. That is why they cry out, saying, let us go and slaughter to our Elohim. Let more work be laid on the men, so that they labor in it and not pay attention to the words of falsehood. And the slave drivers of the people and their foremen went out and spoke to the people, saying, thus said Pharaoh, I do not give you straw. Go take straw for yourselves wherever you find it, for your work shall not be diminished. And the people were scattered in all the land of Mitzrayim to gather stubble for straw. And the slave drivers are hurrying them on, saying, complete your work, your daily amount, as when there was straw. Also the foremen of the children of Israel, whom Pharaoh's slave drivers had set over them, were beaten and were asked, why have you not completed your task in making bricks both yesterday and today as before? And the foreman of the children of Israel came and cried out to Pharaoh, saying, why do you treat your servants this way? There is no straw given to your servants, and they say to us, make bricks. And you see, your servants are beaten, but your own people are at fault. But he said, you are idle. You are idle. That is why you say, let us go to slaughter to Yahweh. So now go, work, and the straw is not given to you, but deliver the amount of the bricks. And the foreman of the children of Israel saw that they were in trouble after it was said, you are not to diminish the daily amount of bricks. And when they came out from Pharaoh, they met Moshe and Aaron, who stood there to meet them, and they said to them, let Yahweh look on you and judge, because you have made us loathsome in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of his servants, to give a sword in their hand to kill us. And Moshe returned to Yahweh and said, Yahweh, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you send me? Now, all of that was to get to verse 23. For ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your authority, in your name, in your reputation, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all. You see, Yahweh gave him a task. He went to do it. He went to do it in Yahweh's name, authority, reputation. And now Moses is confused. And reasonably so. You know, he said, look, I went to do what you said. I did everything you said. And now the people are worse off than before. What in the world is going on here? I don't get it. He said, look, I've done what you said, but ever since I've come to Pharaoh to speak in your name, you know, he's done evil to your people. And you've not delivered them at all. So what is going on? So now let's go to chapter 6. Let's go to chapter 6. And Yahweh said to Moshe, verse 1, now see what I do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he's going to let you go, and with a strong hand he's going to drive them out of his land. And Elohim spoke to Moshe and said to him, I am Yahweh. I am Yahweh. Now realize, as we get through this teaching, and we're probably not going to get to it today, but as we get through this teaching, at some point when we get into Leviticus, we're going to see that there's a certain point between chapters 17, 18, 19, and 20, and I'm not going to cover every one of them, where Yahweh says 4 or 5 things and then finishes those 4 or 5 things off with, I am Yahweh. In other words, I have that authority. I have the reputation, the identity. I've got the power. In other words, it's like a parent saying, because I said so. Because I'm your mother. Because I'm your father. Anybody ever heard that growing up? But I don't understand. Just do what I said, because I'm your father and you need to just do what I said. And so he's saying here, and Elohim spoke to Moshe and said to him, I am Yahweh. In other words, you're not Yahweh, I'm Yahweh. What I say gets to go. And he says in verse 3, he says, and I appeared to Abraham. Now he's going to kind of remind him who he is. He's going to give him the identifiers. I appeared to Abraham, to Yitzchak, and to Yaakov as El Shaddai. Didn't he? We already saw that verse that we read earlier where he says, he was referred to as El Shaddai. And by my name Yahweh was I not known to them. He says, and I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their sojournings in which they have sojourned. And I have also heard the groanings of the children of Israel, whom the Mitzrites are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. So now he's reminding Moses, look, don't let appearances confuse you. See, we do that all the time. How many of us, and maybe you can raise your hand or not, it's up to you, but how many of you, when you came into this, it got worse before it got better? Okay? Isn't that the same thing that's happening here with the Israelites in Egypt? It got worse before it got better. And it's not over yet. It's going to keep getting worse because Israel's going to go through the first couple of plagues with the Egyptians. So it got worse before it got better. And so we have an example of it right here. Right here in the story of Israel in Egypt. He says, I've heard their groanings, and I have remembered my covenant. Verse 5. Say therefore to the children of Israel, I am Yahweh, and I shall bring you out from under the burdens of the Mitzrites, and shall deliver you from their enslaving, and shall redeem you with an outstretched arm and great judgments. I shall take you as my people, and I shall be your Elohim, and you shall know that I am Yahweh your Elohim, who is bringing you out from under the burdens of the Mitzrites. And I shall bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob, to give it to you as an inheritance. I am Yahweh. Okay, so let's just stop there. So here we see that as they're going through this process, Yahweh's laying out, he said, look, don't think for a second that I don't have that power and authority. I am who I am. And I can do anything. I'm just allowing these things to happen because it's going to bring greater glory to my name, and it's going to make a greater case to my people that I am who I am. Kind of like the one who was needing healing that Yeshua healed, and they said, well, who sinned, him or his father or his parents? And Yeshua said, no, he was allowed to suffer so that I could do the miracles that you would believe in me. Well, the same thing here. The sufferings that are going to continue to happen here and only get worse for a little while were to strengthen, because of the miracles, the belief in Yahweh as being who he is. And here's our covenant first listed out to some degree in verse 6 through 8 here. He says, say to the children, I am Yahweh, and I'm going to bring you out. These are your 4 cups, by the way, we use at Passover. Okay, I'm going to bring you out. So he says that first. And from under the burdens, I'm going to deliver you. I'm going to redeem you. And I'm going to take you as my people. That's the process here. However, we've got to agree to the process, and that's going to come up in Exodus 19, where our agreement is that we have to agree to obey. We have to agree to obey. Now, we don't have to agree to anything for him to pull us out. But before going into the land, there's this little thing called agreeing to obey that has to be brought into the mix. Now, verse 9, Moses spoke this thus to the children of Israel, and they did not listen to Moses because of the shortness of spirit and from hard slavery. See, they were not ready to believe. That's part of why he's allowing them to suffer and suffer. They weren't ready to believe. This had to be so over the top. And that's why it was so over the top, in order to make the point that we're all, not only were they impressed with the fact that we're so impressed with it now. How many movies have been made about it because it was such an impressive thing? But understand, what you're also going to see, which a lot of people don't teach when they do the Passover, is that each one of the plagues was to make a mockery of the different Egyptian gods. Because he had to not only redeem them and bring them out of physical slavery, but they were also in spiritual bondage as well. They had lost the connection with the true Elohim. They had lost an understanding about the true Elohim. They had lost all of that, and he needed to reconnect it by first showing how ineffective and powerless the other ones were when facing the one true God, the one true mighty one. And so there was a purpose to all of this. So let's continue now, chapter 9. We're still here in Exodus in chapter 9. We'll look at verse 13 in Shemot 9:13. And Yahweh said to Moses, rise early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh and say to him, thus said Yahweh Elohim the Hebrews, let my people go so that they serve me. For at this time I am sending all my plagues onto your heart and your servants and your people, so that you know that there is no one like me in all the earth. Now if I had stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, then you would have been cut off from the earth. And for this reason I have raised you up in order to show you my power, in order to declare my name in all the earth. You still exalt yourself against my people in that you do not let them go. So all of this is happening for what purpose? Verse 16. I'm doing all these things in order for my name to be declared in all the earth. So it's not just about the whole earth saying the name Yahweh. It's the whole earth declaring that this Yahweh is the mighty one. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is the creator of the universe. He has all power, majesty, and authority. That the whole earth would declare who he is by authority, identity, and reputation. Not just a name. Not just a name. Because you know what? Even in Christianity today, people are singing songs with Yahweh in it. And they think that that Yahweh that they're singing to is all for the law being done away with in Christmas and Easter and blah, blah, blah. That is not the name, authority, identity that goes along with that name. So what they've done is, and we're going to get to this in a minute here, what they've done is they've made a mockery of that name. They've made a mockery of that name. Let's go now to Exodus 20. Okay, so in Exodus chapter 20, as we're reading here, we're going to go through the commandments here. And if you notice in the commandments, we're going to see, he starts out with, in verse 1, he says, Elohim spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahweh your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Mitzrayim, out of the house of slavery. So what does he start off with? Making sure you can identify him, not just by name. I'm the one who brought you out of Mitzrayim, out of the house of slavery. You have no other mighty ones against my face or in my face. You don't do this in my face. He says, you do not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of that which is in the heavens above, or which is in the earth beneath, which is in the waters under the earth, and you do not bow down to them nor serve them, for I, Yahweh your Elohim, am a zealous Elohim. Visiting by jealous or zealous, it means that he's going to make sure that I'm not going to leave unpunished. And that's what we're going to read. He says, look, I'm zealous, I'm fierce. He says, in visiting the crookedness of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing kindness to thousands to those who love me and guard my commands. Now, having said all of that, look what he gets to verse 7. You do not bring the name of Yahweh your Elohim to nothing, for Yahweh does not leave the one unpunished who brings his name to nothing. Now, what we have here in the verse where it says not bring his name to nothing is we have the idea of that bringing his name to nothing is making it, smearing it, making it mean a falsehood. There's deceptiveness to it. That's what the Hebrew word there means. In other words, if I tell you that I am a certain way and that I act in a different way, then my reputation and what I'm claiming don't match. And that's what he's saying here. You are not to claim to be children of the living Elohim and then act in a way that is contrary to being a child of the living Elohim. He's saying you are not to do that. You are not to take my name and make it a confusion or a deception or mislead people, a falsehood. Okay, this has nothing to do with taking the name and saying it inappropriately at the wrong time, or, that's why the Jews have turned to the point where they won't ever say the name. This has nothing to do with pronouncing it. It has everything to do with the first 3 verses that lead to this verse. Or I should say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? All these verses here is talking about not having other mighty ones. I am the only one. You are not to make an image, not to bow down to another image. Why? Because if you did so, you would make my name mean nothing. You would confuse people as to what my name means, which would make it not have the value and the power that it should have. My reputation will be tainted and confused. My identity would be tainted and confused. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am the one who brought you out of Egypt. I am not the one that does all this other stuff that these other nations do scattered around all the other nations. And so it's really important that we understand as we go through this, as he's laying it out, that we understand what it means to bring the name to nothing. Now, there are other places that we may get to as we're going through the study here, where he'll say, and don't do this, and don't do that, and don't do this, and don't do that, and don't make my name mean nothing. Don't take the name of Yahweh in vain. And what it's basically saying is that it just means nothing. Okay, if I tell you that I'm in charge and you better listen to me, and then I threaten to punish you and everything else, and it turns out I really have no power to do any of those things, then it's really in vain that I would say those things. You see, that's where the vainness of it is I'm saying it, but it's really, I'm doing it in vain because you know I can't do it. You know it's not true. And so that's the idea here, is that we don't want to take the name and then make the name now connected to something that is misleading or deceptive or untrue, because now we've done damage and dishonored his name. We've dishonored his reputation. We've dishonored his identity. We've dishonored claiming to be a part of his lineage. And so it's very important as we go through this that we are clear about that whole process, that as we're going through this, that we do not want to do damage to his reputation or name, which is why when we do mikvah, the last thing that I have you declare when we do the 8 declarations of mikvah is that you are declaring to walk out the rest of your life in such a way as to bring the names of Yahweh and Yeshua honor and glory and not shame. That's why I really would encourage everyone, and this would sound a little strange maybe, not to put your seat on until you're ready to do that. Not necessarily that you'll be perfect, but you need to wear them. But when you're wearing them, what is it doing? It's declaring who you serve, who you follow. It's declaring your lineage, the reputation of the lineage. And so don't put on a set of seat and act the fool. Don't act like the world. Don't do the things that are not of Abba. Not with those seat on. And so people will be watching you. They know what those things mean because you've told them, they've asked, what's that all about? Oh, in the Bible it says. Okay. And they're watching you. They're watching you pop your cork when you lose your temper. They're watching you say things that shouldn't come out of your mouth. They're watching you if you're flirting with people you shouldn't be flirting with. They're watching you. They're watching you walk into the store on Shabbat. They're watching you getting gas on Shabbat. They're watching you, they're all, walking into whatever you're doing. They're watching you. So what is that? You are representing the identity, the authority, the one who created all things, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And do you take that with proper and appropriate fear and trembling? Now we go to verse 22 in chapter 20. Because remember what he said in verse 7, he says, look, he's not going to leave the one unpunished who brings shame and dishonor to his name. So that's why people must be very careful out there on the internet who are claiming, thus said Yahweh, when Yahweh hadn't said. That's Ezekiel 22. Her priests have done violence to my teachings. And we go further down, that was starting in verse 22 or 23. By the time we get to 24, 25, he said, and they define a lie for them, and they claim that thus said Yahweh when Yahweh hadn't said. Be really, 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 really reluctant to say thus said Yahweh. Because I could probably guarantee you he hadn't said a word to you, that it's you, and it's what you wanted to say, and you want to feel special and some other thing, maybe even on an unconscious level, subconsciously. But Yahweh generally is not speaking to people and giving them words. What he's doing is inspiring, hopefully, people like me to read his word, as opposed to saying I was given a word. I was given a word. You know what the word is? This word. It's in a book. I was given this word. It's available to all of you, and I was given the authority to read it with authority. That's all. But I'm not going to come here and say, oh, I was visited yesterday by Abba, and he told me to tell you. There are people out there, self-proclaimed prophets and prophetesses, doing that every day. Some of which used to attend here. And they'll spend, and almost every other word out of their mouth is, Abba told me, Yahweh told me, this is what he told me is going to happen, and they've got a word. I would be scared to death. I mean, if I actually heard his voice and he actually told me to tell you, I would be verifying that 6 ways from Sunday, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? because I would not want to stand up here thinking that there's any possibility that that was any other voice but his. You understand what I'm saying? We should be afraid to just claim those things. I'm not saying he doesn't speak to people, but generally if he does, he's telling you what you need to do for you. The job of telling other people what to do is given to the prophet, and generally the prophet talks to leadership and doesn't talk to the people in general. And so it's not the way that most people think it lays out. But in verse 22 he says, and Yahweh said to Moses, say to the children of Israel, you yourselves have seen that I've spoken to you from the heavens. You do not make besides me mighty ones of silver, and do not make mighty ones of gold for yourselves. Make an altar of earth for me, and you shall slaughter on it, and your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your cattle. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I shall come to you and bless you. Now, the reason I wanted to get to that verse is because that's what was going on. Remember I said earlier when Abraham was setting up altars? That's what he was doing. He was setting up an altar in a place where his name was being remembered. See, Abraham wanted to remember what had happened in that place. In that place, a blessing was given to him, or was confirmed or reaffirmed to him. In that place, something happened, and he set up an altar, and it was there that he would remember the reputation, the authority, the power, the identity, the awesomeness of his Elohim. He says, make an altar, and in every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I shall come to you and bless you. So in every place where I cause my name to be remembered. So where are those places today? I'd be reluctant to claim. But maybe a place like this can be a place like that if this is a place where we're causing his name to be remembered. Because we're going to find other verses if we go through this, as we keep going further, where he says about making altars and going and bringing offerings to the place where his name dwells, where it dwells or resides. So what does that mean, to dwell or reside? Well, where is his authority residing? Where is his reputation residing? Where is his identity and his lineage residing? And that's where we need to go. And so it should be, somebody pointed to themselves and said, yeah, it should be here. Not often is that the way it really works in the body. But we are supposed to be the temple of the living Elohim. Don't you know that your own body is the temple of the living Elohim, 1 Corinthians? And so, in theory, that should work. But see, when you're acting in so much un-Yahweh-like manner, we're wondering, does the name actually dwell there? We know that the Spirit may still dwell there. The Spirit is there to help kind of clean you up, to teach and instruct you. But is he, in his reputation, dwelling there if you're doing what you're doing that you shouldn't be doing? And that's really where it gets really critical, is to understand, are we actually doing what we need to be doing, or are we doing things we should not or ought not be doing? Let's go to verse 21 of chapter 23. Verse 21 of chapter 23. He says, we're still in Exodus. He says, be on guard before him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he is not going to pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. So now he's talking about sending a messenger. In verse 20, he says, see, I am sending a messenger before you to guard you in the way and to bring you into the place which I prepared for you. Be on guard before him and obey his voice, and don't rebel against him, for he is not going to pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. Oh, then we're getting back to this. We're going to put Yahweh into his name? Or is it going to say, look, my identity, my authority, my reputation is all in him. He is an ambassador of the living Elohim. He's representing the living Elohim. We can argue about who this is in another argument, but let's just understand, whoever it is, has the full weight and backing of authority of Elohim. He says, you better not rebel against him, for he is not going to pardon, for he has my name in him. But if you diligently obey his voice, and you shall do all that I speak, then I shall be an enemy to your enemies and a distresser to those who distress you. But notice that he dropped down to verse 24. He says, but do not bow down to their mighty ones, because my messenger is going to bring you into the land of all these ites in verse 23. He says, don't bow down to their mighty ones, nor serve them, or do according to their works. but without fail overthrow them, without fail break down their pillars, and you shall serve Yahweh your Elohim, and he shall bless you, your bread and your water, etc. So what's going on here? He's saying, look, be careful, don't do what they do. He says, in verse 32, dropping down, it says, don't make a covenant with them, nor with their mighty ones. Let them not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me when you serve their mighty ones, when it becomes a snare to you. You know, there is a reason at some point to have to put people outside the camp, because those people outside the camp will start influencing the people in the camp. And this is one of those funny things. I have people on a regular basis who will say to me, well, I'm still going to my Sunday church because I'm going to help bring them out of the church and stuff. Good luck. It doesn't work that way, folks. Oh, okay, somebody's going to write me an email and tell me, well, it worked in my church. Well, then you're the exception. Okay, I've been doing this more than 5 minutes. I've had conversations with people for almost 20 years now, and I can promise you, generally speaking, it doesn't work. What is working is that you're trying to justify being where you want to be because you're not ready to leave. And there's still a lot of influence that they're having on you, not you on them. They don't want your influence. They do, however, want to influence you. So stop that whole lying to yourself saying, well, I'm going to help them come out. No, you're not. It doesn't work that way. Listen to the Father and the Son teaching. They, if they're going to be drawn out, will only be drawn out by the Father and the Son. And then they can be led to you when they remember that you left. So, leaving, you may tell them when you leave, by the way, I'm leaving because I found something else that makes more sense and I found a deeper truth. Whatever it is that you explain to them, loving, gentle, meek, etc., they'll remember that, and then if they're led out, they'll know to come to look for you. You need not sit in that place where, look what it says here. It says, let them not dwell in your land. The same thing, you don't go dwell and hang out with them all day long because there's a chance that it could be a snare to you and you get caught up in what they're doing and you're thinking they're going to get caught up in what you're doing. More often than not, it works the other way. Much more often than not, it works the other way. And so you don't want to end up in that place. You do not want to end up in that place. In Leviticus chapter, let's see how I want to play this out real quick if I can. You know what? We're going to stop here because I'm not going to squeeze the rest of this in as best I thought I could. Let's just stop here, but hopefully we're getting a good start into the Tanakh. We're not going to spend a lot of parts in the Tanakh because I think we can make this point and maybe wrap it up even next week. And then I'll make a complete completion of this teaching series right before we go to Sukkot, which would be nice. So then we'll have it completed. So that's going to be my effort next week. Father, we want to come before you. And Father, we want to lift up your holy name. Father, we want to fully embrace who you are, what your authority is. We want to make sure that we're not disrespecting your reputation, but that we're sharing and expounding on to the peoples around us who and what you are and what your reputation truly is. We want to recognize you and identify you correctly. And Father, we want to make sure as being a part of your lineage, now that we understand that we are owned and possessed by you, we belong to you, and as claiming to be children of the living Elohim, that we make sure that we are not breaking the third commandment by making your name become a confusion, become desolate, become void. Father, that we would bring only glory and honor to your name. So, Father, as we come before you here in this study about the name, about your authority, about your name, Father, help us to embrace you as the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov, as the one, the mighty one who brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, as the one who is going to do the same for the greater exodus that we're looking forward to, as the one who reigns on high, who is and who was and who is to come. And so, Father, we come before you, delighting in your name, worshiping in your name, and embracing the fullness of what your name stands for. So, Father, having said all that, we come to you in the authority of the name that you've given to be above all names, that you desire to shed upon and to give and to bestow upon your Son, our Savior, our High Priest, the coming Messiah, the coming King of Kings, Yeshua, Mishikenu, Yeshua our Messiah. And we all say together, Amen ve'amen.